Welcome to Praxis, a podcast where we explore how to practice and embody the way of Jesus in our everyday lives. Thanks so much for taking the time to listen. Today, we're continuing a series on what some experts are calling the Great Dechurching. We are currently living in the single greatest religious shift in American history. 40 million adults who once attended church no longer do so, and most of that change has taken place in the last 25 years. The result of this dechurching is more than just diminished church attendance. The seismic shift is dramatically reshaping the communities that we live in. So, why are people leaving the church? What exactly are they missing out on? What does it look like to engage the dechurched in a Christ-centered way? Answering these questions is what we're setting out to do. We believe this is a discussion that needs to take place within our churches, because if we are to be faithful followers of Jesus in today's landscape, we must figure out what it looks like to engage a dechurched culture. Today, we're going to look at what it might look like to engage the people who have dechurched in our lives. So let's get into it.
Well, welcome everybody. My name is Josiah.
I'm Katie.
And I'm Mac.
So guys, it is Christmas time. Christmas time is here. I would love to hear what are some of your favorite things about Christmas?
I enjoy the food at Christmas time. Like there's all these traditions around holiday food in our family, and it's always so good. So yeah, we growing up used to do fondue on Christmas Eve, which was just kind of like a once a year type thing and super interesting. And it would slow things down because everybody's sort of like putting what they want on the skewer, and then you have to wait for it to cook. And so everybody's talking and just slows it down.
That's fun.
So it's some of those types of things where it's like, hey, these are traditional things we do, and it's delicious, and it's presents. It creates presents for us, like being together, that I just really enjoy.
Yeah.
Yeah, food's a good one. I've been really loving how my house is decorated this year. So I'm not like a big house decoration person. I'm not someone who has like the fall decor and the Easter stuff and whatever. But I just love like getting up in the morning. We have these like twinkling lights on the mantle, and our Christmas tree is up, and it just feels so cozy. The fireplace, I love it. I really appreciate like walking into a home that just like screams Christmas cozy.
Yeah. There's some movies. We usually watch Home Alone at some point during the holidays. Growing up, I remember that one, The Christmas Story, where he asked for a rifle. Can I share a funny? Can I share a funny story? I'm walking out the door this morning to come here to church, and Josie's like, "Well, never a dull moment with Griffin." I'm like, "Oh no, what happened?" Griffin's very orally fixated. It's sort of a characteristic of Down syndrome. So apparently, it's like negative digits today.
Yeah.
Super cold. Like this is the first day of the year, this winter season, where you walk outside and if you breathe through your nose, your nose hairs freeze, right? So I guess they're getting to school, and we walk him to school, get him all bundled up and walk to school. He decided to stick out his tongue and put it on the stroller.
No.
And it got stuck.
Oh,
No way.
They had to take it off, and he was like bleeding everywhere.
Oh no.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. It was all over his scarf. It was just like, yeah, totally. So I immediately thought of the Christmas story this morning, because that is just such a classic scene where he gets his tongue stuck on a flagpole. My son got his tongue stuck on the stroller.
That scene is going to carry a whole new level of meaning now every time you watch that movie.
Yep, literally bleeding all over.
Oh, that sounds so painful.
I'm laughing because it's just kind of like, it's Griffin. You gotta.
It's Griffin.
I remember as a kid, we would like dare each other to do it.
Yeah.
It would get stuck, but never like
Stuck.
Frost. Yeah. Yeah, I like all the feels with Christmas. I love listening to jazzy instrumental renditions of Christmas songs, chilling out by the fireplace. Honestly, my favorite moment is always at Christmas, that moment after, okay, presents are done and the kids are playing with their stuff, and you sit down, either have like a cup of coffee or something, and that feeling when like all the rush to push towards Christmas is done and you can just sit down and enjoy it, usually only lasts a little bit of time. But when I think of like my favorite part of Christmas, I think of that moment.
Yeah.
And usually the house is a mess. It's not clean yet.
That is a good moment.
You know
It's
what?
like, okay, it's done. Like all the rush, and now we just sit.
Yeah.
I feel like I share a moment, particularly with you, Josiah, every year around Christmas that fills me up. And it's typically at the end, the last Christmas Eve service, whatever that is, because it's similar to that. It's like all this like, energy and planning.
Yeah.
And then finally there's like the execution of the service. And I just have years of memories of like getting through Christmas Eve, and the building has sort of like, people filed
Cleared out.
and you're sort of sitting there and you're like, that was amazing.
Yeah.
Like we got to worship together.
Yeah,
It's a good feeling.
for sure.
Well, speaking of getting your taste buds ripped off by freezing cold poles, we're in a series right now on what experts are calling the Great Dechurching. As we said in our intro, we're living in the greatest religious shift in American history. Roughly 40 million people who once belonged to a church, meaning they attended church at least once per month, have now left the church, and now they go less than a year. And we will feel this at Christmas time. I remember just a decade ago, Christmas used to be this thing where like you'd have so many visitors, right? You had to like plan how many services do we need to have and so on. Well, you know what? Now studies show that less than 50% of Americans will even attend at Christmas time. So there's a shift happening. There's a mass exodus happening from the church, and this mass exodus has all taken place in the last 25 years. And it's hard, I think, to wrap our minds around the number, right? It's 40 million people. It's hard to wrap your mind around that. So I'm trying to provide reference points for people. This is somewhat comparable to like all the people living in New York City, Chicago, and LA combined. All right? Wisconsin has roughly 6 million people. So this is like 6.5 Wisconsins.
It's a lot.
It's like the entire state of California. That's what we're talking about. So this is not an insignificant number. It's a mind-boggling, massive amount of people. So we're in this series because it feels important. In the first episode, we attempted to name some of like the 5 biggest reasons why people are dechurching. And we talked about things all the way from church hurt to deconstruction to life transitions. And we tried to do this in a non-defensive way, full of compassion. As I've engaged those who have dechurched, listened to their stories and their reasons for leaving, there's so much that I feel like I can affirm. The church needs reforming. Right? We have not been shy about naming some of the ways the church needs to be reformed in this podcast. And I just want to say again, these are people that I deeply love and care about. I sympathize with them. So I ended up in a conversation with someone that I absolutely loved just last week, and he and his wife used to attend our church and left a couple of years ago. And much of the reasons for their departure I could relate to and affirm. And so it's just to say and remind us that those who have dechurched, they're not ignorant or stupid. Like these are people we love and care about. So we want to keep that front and center. In our second episode, we shared some of the things we believe those who have dechurched are missing out on. Things like being connected to the heart and the mission of God in the world, being part of a supportive community, a community that's diverse, impactful, and transformative. And we named, of course, you can find some of these things in other places. Of course you can. And of course the church isn't doing all of these things very well, of course. But the church is one of the few places that's trying to do all these things at the same time. And many of the people I talk to that have dechurched often admit that they're missing some of these key ingredients. So I want to be clear, our last episode wasn't an apologetic to put the dechurched in their place. That wasn't our posture, but rather we were just saying, here's why we, as people who work on a church staff and are giving our lives to this, here's why we're willing to give our best here. All right. And so today we're going to wrap up this series by talking about how to engage those who have dechurched. if 40 million people have dechurched in the last 25 years, the chances are fairly high that you're going to meet with someone who has dechurched, interact with them, or maybe you already are in a relationship with someone who has dechurched. And so our sneaking suspicion is that this will be a prevalent thing in each one of our lives. So today we want to have a conversation about what it looks like to relate to those who have dechurched in ways that are constructive and helpful rather than hurtful and harmful. So that's where we're headed today.
Yeah. And before we get too far into that, I want to name this as almost like a disclaimer at the top of the conversation that this is more than just a topic. And I know you already alluded that to this, Mac, but these are real people. They're people we all know and love. And we're pretty aware that although most of our audience is probably made up of church goers, we know that some of you listening fall into the dechurched category, and we want you to hear our heart, that we have a heart that everybody who follows Jesus could experience authentic church community in a way that lines up with those things Mac was mentioning earlier. And for those of us who are listening and we are, find ourselves in church and we're engaging this conversation, we're going to avoid broad assumptions and judgments and embrace it with a sense of curiosity, but more than just asking why, a compassionate curiosity that actually cares about knowing why, so that we can connect with the people in our lives.
Yeah, and in order to talk about how to engage the dechurched, it might also be helpful to discuss how not to engage the dechurched. So related to what you're saying, Josiah, we've tried to get at this in our previous episodes, but I think we have some shared convictions around what's really unhelpful when it comes to engaging those who are dechurched. What would you guys say we should make sure not to do?
Yeah, I agree that this should be our starting point. I mean, many of the people I know who have dechurched, in part, they did so because of the relational dynamics they experienced within the church. And unfortunately, many of the ways Christians continue to engage them only reinforce the reasons why they left in the first place. And so again, the guy I talked to last week, this was it. He's like, here's how he experienced Christians growing up and many Christians in the church. That's not everybody, so there are disclaimers there. But now when they continue to interact with their family and with some other Christians, they continue to reinforce the negative stereotypes that aren't good.
Yeah.
So I think we have to get clear on here's some of the ways that we can engage that are hurtful and harmful, and we want to avoid those. So one thing I would say is don't pull the levers of fear, guilt, or shame. Don't leverage guilt, fear, or shame to manipulate someone or attempt to manipulate or coerce someone into returning to church. I just find this really unhelpful. And I'll say much of what I want to contribute about how not to engage, I think has a lot of parallels with how messed up evangelism can be. Right? Because some of the primary ways people have been taught to share the quote unquote good news, it honestly doesn't sound like good news because they're pulling the levers of fear, guilt, and shame in order to get someone to pray a prayer or something like that. And so fear, hey, if you were to die tonight, do you know where you'd go? Is it heaven or is it hell? That's a fear tactic, right? Guilt. Have you ever told a lie? Well, that makes you a liar. So the entry point is trying to convince someone of their moral depravity, right? And that they're guilty. Shame. God sees everything you've done and can't bear being around you, right? Now the point is, because I've heard the counter responses, well, those things are true. You're guilty, you're this. The point isn't whether these things are true or not. Of course they are. Of course those things are true. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and I know the verses. But the point is, this is not how Jesus did evangelism, right? You don't see Jesus walking around Galilee pulling the levers of fear, guilt, and shame to coerce people into a decision. He just doesn't engage people that way. These are actually the primary tools that Satan uses to keep us in bondage.
Yeah.
Right? He accuses us, leverages fear, and uses shame techniques. And it's clear in Romans 2, it's the kindness of the Lord that leads to repentance. So while God can and has used some of these, I think, malformative gospel presentations to draw himself to us, that's because of how big his grace is. not because those tactics are the way that we should be operating. And my concern is that we can do the same thing when it comes to engaging the dechurched. So a fear tactic might involve employing some sort of scare tactic like, hey, you're going to lose your faith if you walk away from the church, right? In order to try to get them to return to church. Or guilt might involve emphasizing duty or one's obligation to be part of a church. You're letting God down and not being obedient to God by attending a church. Maybe shame might be something like, you used to be such a strong Christian, right? What's happened? Some of these strategies, again, some people would respond by going, but they work. And I would say, okay, maybe in the short run, but I'm convinced this is just not how God relates to us.
Yeah.
Rather, when it comes to engaging the D-church, we got to learn how to engage with cruciform love, that's cross-shaped love, rather than manipulate people using these types of levers.
Yeah, this makes me think of a friend I had that recently dechurched and deconstructed. So she left the church and she walked away from faith altogether. And leading up to that point, she had a series of conversations with her pastor and church leadership about all sorts of questions. These questions about the Bible. How do we know the Bible's true? It was written so long ago. How do we know that Jesus is who he really says he is? So she had this long kind of journey of conversations and questions that she didn't feel like were answered well. But in her last conversation, what she would describe as like what became the last straw for her, she was talking to her pastor, and finally he looked at her and said, all right, he did the Pascal's wager thing. Okay, so he said, if I believe in God and I'm wrong, then like what's the harm to me?
Sure.
But if you don't believe in God and it ends up that you're wrong, well, then you're going to pay for it for all of eternity. And that to her was that fear-based tactic that she, in her mind, she went, if that's what you're using to keep me here, like I'm done. And I think to her, it made it seem like, well, hey, if that's the foundation that it's underneath this faith, then it's not a faith that's worth holding on to.
Yeah.
So I guess the unfortunate part for me in that story is that pastor felt the need to rely on something.
Came down to this sort of a wager.
Yeah, when there's such a more beautiful invitation that we'll get into. But I just have tons of stories like that of friends who grew up in faith contexts with guilt, shame, fear, and many, if not all of them, have walked away from faith entirely.
Yeah, I alluded to a story earlier where I was in a conversation with a couple this past summer who I'm close to. I enjoy this couple. They've dechurched. But the conversation was happening among a group of us, and they started to name that they no longer attend a church, and someone else who was present got super reactive. You could tell that information upset them, and the primary lever they used was guilt. They essentially sent the message like, hey, good Christians go to church, which of course implies you're not a good Christian. And so what happened, they immediately sort of shut down. They stopped talking about, you could just tell it was like sort of a conversation ender. And I had the opportunity to circle back to the conversation and reopen it. But it's just to say, man, if the way you're engaging with someone who's not part of a church causes them to shut down, which you may not be responsible for. I get people can have their own stuff that causes them to shut down, and they're responsible for their triggers. But it's at least worth reflecting. Did I contribute to that dynamic, right? It might not just be them. Maybe you contributed. The way you related to them wasn't conducive for safety or a spiritual conversation to flourish or begin. That makes sense?
Yeah. Yeah, if we can't find a good, if we can't find a way to manage our own anxiety in those types of conversations as churchgoers, we end up reacting out of that rather than being responsive to the Holy Spirit. And I think that's really important because these types of tactics don't allow people even the opportunity to own why they left. Like if we just pull on these things, we're trying to essentially own it for them. We're taking the responsibility of saying, I got to get you back, rather than being present, tilting the table towards them, asking questions, and allowing them to own why they left.
Yeah.
We sort of take it on ourselves.
The bullseye here is Jesus, you guys. I mean, Jesus gives us a master class in what it looks like to interact with a wide variety of people that are spiritually all over the place. And by and large, you don't see people turtling up or shutting down because of the way Jesus is talking to them. It's actually the exact opposite. They're seeking him out. They're wanting to talk with him. They're wanting to be with him, right? So there's something significantly wrong if we're leveraging things that are producing the exact opposite.
While using the name Jesus.
And betraying the way of Jesus in the process. So that's the first thing I would say. Again, lots of connections, and maybe we could do an episode on this in the future, just around evangelism in general and what that looks like. But I think pulling the levers of fear, guilt, and shame do horrendous work when it comes to entering this conversational space.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe another tactic that does not do good work is being argumentative.
Whatever. I totally disagree with you.
I mean, I'm a trained lawyer, so this one could be really tough for me. But I don't think it's just me. I think it's kind of human nature anytime we encounter someone who thinks differently than us to want to change their minds. And I think one of the ways that we try to change people's minds is through arguments and facts and reason. I remember being a kid, my dad would sometimes take me to these debates.
I can totally see him
couldn't
doing
you?
that. Oh my
Loves
gosh.
that stuff. Like 7-day creation. Like one person would be debating for it and one would be against it. And he loved it. It was fine. I enjoyed spending time with my dad. But of all the debates I've ever witnessed, I mean, that stuff.
My dad took me to baseball games.
Sounds more fun. I'm like 7. We're like debating on the way home, like deconstructing the arguments. But no, I think of all the arguments I've ever witnessed, whether it's like a debate or just in normal life, I can't recall a single time I've ever seen someone change their mind as a result of an argument. Right? Can you guys? Like I think it doesn't really happen. As much as we'd like to think differently, it's not often that someone goes, "Oh, okay, I see what you mean. I guess I'll join your church and begin to follow Jesus," or whatever. Like that doesn't happen. And like you said, Mac, we needn't look further than Jesus. If we look in the Gospels, Jesus didn't argue with people, just like he didn't use fear, guilt, and shame. And I think the reason was because he didn't try to control people. Like he gave them a lot of freedom to think what they wanted to think and feel what they wanted to feel. He respected their agency and their autonomy. So again, I think it's important to keep our eyes on Jesus and go, well, how did he do this? And when it can feel so tempting to really get sucked into needing to double down and prove our point, just don't do it. It doesn't get you anywhere. One caveat would be, I'm not saying don't be prepared with answers when questions come. Right? 1 Peter 3:15 says, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect. So those are key words there for me, gentleness and respect. I think that will get us a lot farther than being argumentative.
Yeah, those are posture words, right? And it's hard. Let's just say, okay, this is hard. And partly because tapping into your field, Josiah, I mean, you're in school for psychology and so on. But when someone disagrees with us, we often experience that as a threat, right? So someone challenges you or says, oh, I don't see it that way. And what happens is it activates our amygdala, which is responsible for processing those threats. And we go into fight or flight. And so when we engage with someone who's different than us, we experience it as a threat and we respond like we're face-to-face with a grizzly bear. But in fact, you're just being faced with somebody who thinks or believes differently.
You're just in a conversation.
So instead of remaining calm or relationally connected, we get big and loud or we run away or whatever. And so there is some work to do. I think kind of piggybacking on what you said, Katie, is just to recognize, hey, there's some work I have to do probably in my own body to remain calm and sort of lower the volume on, hey, I'm not under attack here. I'm not being threatened here. Take a few deep breaths, And then there's probably some work we have to do to regain our prefrontal cortex. Tricia Taylor often says, hey, when I get furious, I get curious. In other words, orient with questions, and that shifts us from being emotionally reactive to cognitively engaged. And I really like what you said, that people usually don't respond by being put in their place intellectually. You can win the debate and actually lose the exchange, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think that often we argue out of our own insecurities. Often. So I think often when we engage these things from an argumentative posture, generally we're sort of afraid to let someone in our lives believe differently than us. It takes some good differentiation in order to do that well. And honestly, that will go well beyond just engaging the Dechurched. It'll probably help in a lot of family relationships and things as well.
Totally.
Being able to disagree with someone and walk away and having it be okay.
Go back and listen to the EQ series
Yeah,
we
right.
did
That's what I was just thinking.
on emotional intelligence and maturity, because it's impossible to do this work without some degree of emotional maturity and self-regulation. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. Another one I would name is don't be judgmental or dismissive. I was reflecting on this. I think this is actually a very tricky one for people, especially if you've grown up in an environment where you were raised to dismiss people.
What do you mean by that?
So when someone is and they're in the church and they adhere to the belief systems that you believe within the group, then they're in. But the second they start questioning that, it becomes a threat to
The group.
And you can watch, like as a kid, you could watch the group behavior start to orient to these people differently rather than welcoming questions and saying, let's talk about it, or let's sit in the tension. Like, hey, I have questions too. Let's sit with this together. Love to talk with you more about it. It became, they're backsliding. We need to pray for them. And a lot of those issues end up becoming dismissed rather than attended to.
So instead of creating like a hospitable space to remain present to those who have questions or, whatever they're questioning, it's almost like the group, out of a sense of threat, helps them hit the eject button through rejection and judgment.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think for the most part, like that was encouraged. I mean, maybe not like overtly, but as I reflect on, and I don't want to put too much blame on my environment, but I just remember that judgmental posture towards people was very much ingrained in me, and it took many years, many years. And you can still feel it bubble up. I'm not going to blame it all on the upbringing. I think all of us have a tendency to do that. You look at other people who do it differently, believe something differently, and you start dismissing them for being different. So I think it takes a lot of maturity to reach a point where you aren't relating to people that way. But I think that where the I guess where the rubber meets the road is we're never going to grow as a community or as people if we can't learn to listen and take seriously the experiences of people who have left. And if you find yourself dismissing them, dismissing those experiences before you actually even hear them out because you think you know better, we're not going to grow. Like our church community isn't going to grow. I mean, the reality is, we talked about it, was it last week or the first part of this series, where in reality, a lot of the reasons why people have left are very legitimate. They're things that were very legitimate experiences, and
they highlight things we need to attend to as a church. Like
it ends up thwarting our whole process of growth as a church community,
right? To
not learn to grow in these areas.
To the degree we dismiss someone's experience in the church, we actually short circuit our own transformation because it might be highlighting an area that we need to attend to. There's a great book I would recommend when it comes to this point you're making on not being judgmental or dismissive. It was written by Greg Boyd, called Repenting of Religion.
You had me read that, if you remember, when we came back to Crosspoint in 2019.
Did you read it?
I did. You and I just started dialoguing when I came back to Crosspoint, and it was kind of along these lines to some extent, and you recommended I read Repenting of Religion, and I just came across some notes the other day that I had taken from that book. It was so good.
Yeah.
It was so helpful and so good.
Yeah, Greg, in that book, he argues that our tendency to judge people is actually tied up with the very first sin in Genesis 3, where we're sort of grasping for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Like, we get to determine or discern what is good and evil. And when we do that, we're not only we're standing in judgment over other people, so there's a posture of superiority, like we're elevating ourselves above people, but we're actually treading on God's territory too, because God is the one who judges, not us. So we're playing God in those moments. And the biggest takeaway or thread is you can't be loving and judging people at the same time. Judgment is all about ascribing worth to yourself at cost to another person. You're evaluating them in a way that makes you feel superior.
Yep.
So that's the work judgment does. You're subtracting from the worth of someone else in order to add worth to yourself. And cruciform Calvary-like love is the exact opposite of that. It's actually ascribing worth to another person at cost to yourself. So I really encourage you to pick up the book, Repenting of Religion.
It's a little longer read, but it's really good.
Is it?
If I remember correctly.
No.
It's
not?
Okay.
I have like a measure system that I use when I'm like recommending a book, like kind of like a numerical system of like maybe 1 to 4 of like 1 is super easy, 2 is maybe a little bit harder, but still written at a lay level, all the way to 4, which is like, you better be ready to put your thinking cap on.
Yeah.
I'd probably put this at like a 1.5.
Well, I think I just had a baby at that point. My mind might have been a little chaotic.
It's pretty accessible.
No, I like how you explained it. Because I could hear a response to that being, well, we're supposed to be discerning and know the difference between good and evil. But I hear you fleshing out the difference between being discerning about what's good and from God and not from God, and judging people and ascribing worth to them.
Of course. And of course, he'll go into all of those key passages where we learn to distinguish between discernment and judgment. One is forbidden, the other one we actually need to do in our everyday life. So,
one thing that I think is worth noting before we move on to this point is you may be thinking, I was thinking the same thing, Katie, the response from some people might be, well, discerning is an important part of our spiritual development, being discerning and wise, and also like being able to judge what's right and wrong for myself and to be able to follow Jesus. All of that's great. So let's say you have determined that this person is making the wrong choice for their life. Well, congratulations. You have just identified someone that you should be pursuing in relationship, because that's what Jesus did.
Yep.
When he got flack for spending all of his time with the quote unquote sinners, what was his response? He said, "I didn't come for the healthy. I came for the sick."
Yeah.
Yep.
So if you've identified these people as like quote unquote wrong, well then that means you should probably move toward them.
That's absolutely right. And having had this conversation with a lot of people, don't use discernment to dismiss the larger point, which is don't be judgmental and dismissive. Like, you know what I mean? It's like, oh my goodness. Like, yes, of course there's room for discernment. And I can provide some nuance to go, this is what that looks like in a healthy way. But don't hide behind, we need to be discerning in order to continue to practice judgmentalism and dismissiveness. All right.
Yeah. And there are a large handful of passages from Jesus that would back up your point.
Right. Okay.
So we talked a lot about what we shouldn't do, and we do want to avoid all of those things. They reduce safety and relational connection and all of these things that keep us from actually being in relationship with people. So what does it look like then? What can we actively do to embody the way of Jesus towards people who have dechurched? What are some things that we can do on the positive note?
The first thing I would say is you have to discern, going back to that word discern, you have to discern their degree of openness. This is like step one. There was a guy named Edwin Friedman, and he was a rabbi. He's since passed, but he was a rabbi and an expert in family systems theory. Wrote several books, did a lot of organizational consultation and leadership and so on. But he wrote a short little book called Friedman's Fables. Okay. And it's a collection of these short fictional stories, sort of these allegorical tales that get at family systems theory and sort of patterns of how people relate and behave. It's a really fun read. I read this book maybe 4 or 5 years ago on a spring break. And there was this paragraph right at the beginning that I've read. I've pulled this book off the shelf, and I've probably read it about 30 or 40 times.
Wow.
And I want to read it to you.
Okay.
The whole thing?
This paragraph, not the entire book. Here's what he says. He says, the colossal misunderstanding of our time is the assumption that insight will work with people who are unmotivated to change. Communication does not depend on syntax or eloquence or rhetoric or articulation, but on the emotional context in which the message is being heard. People can only hear you when they are moving toward you, and they are not likely to when your words are pursuing them. Even the choicest words lose their power when they are used to overpower. Attitudes are the real figures of speech. So just this will help you in marriage. This will help you in parenting.
Older children. Yep.
People can only hear you when they're moving toward you. That's like the key insight. Doesn't matter how smart, how eloquent, how articulate you are, how airtight your argument is. They're only going to hear it if they're moving toward you. Man, I can't tell you how many times I've made the mistake of assuming I can convince someone who's moving away from me.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And it goes back to your point, Katie, which is like, hey, I can lawyer up in this moment and give an airtight argument that should bring you to your intellectual knees. But if they're not open to you, it's a fruitless endeavor. And you actually you lose the exchange even though you win the argument. Okay. Jesus already knew this. Edwin Friedman, as brilliant as he is not even close to as brilliant as Jesus. He's just elucidating or naming something Jesus is already acutely aware of. Okay? This is why, to me, this is my opinion, but in Luke 10, this is why when Jesus sends out the 72, he told them to look for persons of peace. Okay? In Luke 10, he says, when you enter a house, first say peace to this house, which was a customary Jewish greeting. Shalom to this home. That's what Jesus is telling him to do. If anyone who promotes peace is there, your peace will rest on them. If not, it will return to you. If your peace is reciprocal, he says, stay there, eating and drinking whatever they give you. Do not move around from house to house. So Jesus is instructing these 72. You're going to go out to these villages, and you're going to look for people of peace. How are you going to do that? Well, you're going to declare peace on this home, and if they reciprocate peace, well, then you're going to stay there and eat and enjoy their hospitality, right? Go where the grace is. If someone does not reciprocate peace, well, then move on. And I think it's the same with us. This is the first step, it seems to me, and it's a crucial one, is asking, is this person who has dechurched a person of peace? Are they open to you? Are they moving toward you? Because if not, no amount of dialogue or insight that you provide will work with people who are unmotivated to change, right? Now, I'm not saying, because I've shared this person of peace concept with people many times, and like, so if someone's not a person of peace, do you just like reject them? No, you do what Jesus did. Josiah, you were just saying, how did Jesus relate to people? So you continue to stay present to there and wait for that posture to change, right?
Yeah. Yeah, this again makes me think of that friend I was talking about earlier when we were dialoguing about her journey out of the church and out of faith altogether. She brought up a number of things that I thought, man, I would love to talk more about that. We've been talking about deconstruction as a church for a while, and I had so many good thoughts I felt like I would have loved to share. But I kind of no, not zingers, like genuinely just thoughtful dialogue. I would have loved to have some more dialogue, some deeper dialogue with her and be able to share some of my own thoughts in a loving way. But I maybe put a couple feelers out there and she wasn't really open to that. Like she wanted to tell me her story and that was it. There was no openness. And so, in that moment, I just kind of had to back off. Like it wouldn't have done any good to continue to try to engage in conversation when she just really wasn't looking for that. So yeah, I agree. I don't think we want to chase after people or badger them. It just backfires.
My therapist calls those test balloons, by the way. Like you're getting the way you discern a person of peace, like Jesus' greeting, shalom to this home. It's a test balloon, right? You float it their direction, and if they pop it, you go, oh, they're not interested.
Yep.
Right? What would you say, Josiah? Anything?
Yeah, I just, like, on a positive side, you'll know when someone is open. played in 2 softball leagues this summer. Normally I just do the one. We have like a church men's league, but I decided to join another one from someone at the gym. It was a co-ed league. Anyway, got to build relationships with lots of people that I would not have. But I can't tell you that I lost count of the amount of conversations where people were clearly curious and open to discussing their issues with church or just their issues about why they don't go, things like that. And there was this couple I developed a friendship with, and I can't tell you the amount of conversations we had where they were clearly open to wanting to have the conversations. And my role was not convincing or anything. It was just asking questions. And you can tell when there's the openness there. So you're discerning a moment when clearly there was an openness. They had a test balloon. You're like, okay, they're not ready for that. But there are going to be lots of opportunities if you look for them that where people are clearly open.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This will save you from some frustration along the way if you just start with going, is this person open to me or spiritually seeking? I have 2 people they actually know each other, and they're both have dechurched. One is a person of peace, in my opinion. The other one isn't. Kind of like you're describing, the one who is very open, they love talking about it and asking questions, and you can tell they're genuinely curious, and it's just this different vibe altogether. What if we filled out for a moment? I would say this is one face that a person who's not open can take. Like one way it can manifest is antagonism and argumentation. So with this other guy that has dechurched, love and care about him a ton, every time it comes up, he just wants to debate. He just wants to argue. And I've learned that's actually counterproductive because we're not having intellectual dialogue with a genuine desire to orient towards truth or openness or discovery. It's just have an argument. So maybe to summarize, what I'm trying to get at is, Josiah, yes, I do think you'll be able to tell when someone's open. I think that when someone is closed, it can take a variety of forms, one of which is debate and antagonism.
All right, so once you have discerned a degree of openness and someone is, the next step is simply just to get curious about why. I think of this book I read recently. I actually keep it on my desk because it has some cool references, but it's called The 6 Conversations by Heather Holleman. She's a college professor, and she writes in the book about how important it is for people of faith to learn how to have good conversations with people. And she actually teaches her students on how to do this. And one of the things she references is a great way to disarm someone who is who believes something very drastically different than you, and they're adamant about it, is to ask them, like, I would be so curious to know the story as to how you arrived at that conclusion. Like, I would love to hear the story because that's fascinating to me, because I don't necessarily agree with that. You must have a lot of good reasons to believe that. So that there's this disarming posture of like actually wanting to know why someone is the way they are. And in this context, I think it's the same thing. You can lower defenses a lot by just simply getting curious. It keeps conversations from turning into arguments, and actually allows you to learn something about their story. So, I know we've mentioned this multiple times in this episode already, but the act of curiosity and asking questions is a way to, get to know someone, but beyond that, also like building connection with them.
Yeah, I feel like that's good advice. I mean, a lot of this stuff applies outside of just even the church or de-churching context.
Yeah.
This is just good ways to relate to people in a Jesus way. I mean, you talk about kind of making assumptions about people. Think about politics. Oh, you vote this way, so therefore you must X, Y, and Z. Like it's so ingrained in us, I think, to want to make assumptions and to kind of put people in a box. Oh, you walked away from faith, so you must think this, this, and this. Or, oh, you walked away from a church, well, therefore you must not be a strong Christian. And so I think it's such a good reminder to maintain that curious posture. And for some reason, it feels like sometimes within the church, it can be extra hard for us.
Yeah. Well, and this is the heart behind that first episode in this series is we wanted to make sure we didn't lump everybody who's dechurched into the same profile or category, right? Not everybody has left for the exact same reason. So when we talk about getting curious, to your point, Josiah, why did they dechurch? What were their reasons for dechurching? What experience played a factor in that decision? What was their upbringing? What was their story? And as you listen to people's stories and reasons for leaving the church, there will likely be some things bubbling up that are worth affirming. Mm-hmm. Okay? Perhaps it's how they were treated by a pastor that was really negative. You're going to want to, if they were mistreated, it's important to say, that is mistreated. That's not right. Right? Perhaps it was an authoritarian dogmatism around belief or behavior. Wow. Yeah. That's not that's not what I would want you to experience. Mm-hmm. Perhaps it's how they fuse politics with Jesus. Many churches, I know. I mean, going back to this guy I was talking to last week, those were the two variables he named for their. They were raised in a home where everything was about you have to believe this, and if you don't, you're bad news. Mm-hmm. And it was very fused with a certain partisan camp. And now that they're no longer there, they feel rejected by that, and and it's like, wow, well, yeah, that is destructive. That's not healthy. So I had to affirm that, but there are other ways of orienting, right?
Yeah. So I guess the steps we've named so far is discerning someone's degree of openness. That's a really important point. See is this person a person of peace, as you described it, Mac? And then once you've done that, get curious about the why behind their dechurching and their story. The third step I would name is pay attention to God's activity in their life. So if you've been at Crosspoint for any length of time, you know that one of the things we believe is that God is always present and at work. He's always present and at work. It's something we talk about a lot. It's a key tenet of missional theology. It's an idea that's all over Scripture. Philippians 2:13 says, "For it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose." John 5:17 says, "My Father is always at work to this very day, and I too am working." I think these verses show us how God is actively working within individuals to shape their desire and actions to align with his mission and purposes. And he's just continually involved, and he's present in our lives working towards redemption if we're open to it. So if we believe that, if that's our starting point, we believe that God is present and at work and that he created everybody, right? Like that's our starting point. Every person was created by God. So if God created everyone, he knows how to work in their life and extend invitations to them. So rather than us trying to force something or working overtime to convince them of something, maybe it's worth taking a step back and just trying to pay attention to where God is at work instead. Like, maybe there's a major life transition that they're grappling with, or maybe something is happening in their life that's really difficult. And these things that happen in every human experience can make us more open to God's presence in a new way. And they may not even realize that yet. But as we do this work of evangelizing, so to speak, or sharing the good news with people, I think it's really important that we have that lens. God created this person. He loves them. He's at work. Where is he at work in their life?
This is a game changer to go, okay, I'm going to discern if this is a person of peace, if they're open to me. I'm going to get curious about their story, and then I'm going to be present long enough to be able to discern what God is doing, to become a divine detective. Mm-hmm. What is God doing in this person's life? Because God's been active throughout the duration of their life. I'm just showing up now, so my job is to join the work God is doing because that's what's going to be most effective. And I'll just say, this takes the pressure off. Mm-hmm. When I first experience, like, here's how to do evangelism, it was all about me acting upon someone else to get them to a predetermined place. Mm-hmm. And I took it seriously. Like, you guys, my senior year of high school, I was voted most likely to be a televangelist.
Oh, gosh.
Okay. So I'm not assuming anybody from high school is listening to this, but if you did, I want to publicly apologize. I was like an evangelistic bulldozer. I thought it was my job, and part of it was rooted in like over responsibility to get everybody saved.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it turned me into this crazy person that would force conversations and sort of apply pressure in ways that were so counterproductive. And I'm not saying that we don't have a role to play. I'm saying it's a participatory one, and it really takes the pressure off.
Yeah.
My approach with people has drastically changed as I just realized I get to be present to you, and I'm trying to have my antenna up to what is God doing? Where is God at work in this person's life? And then if I notice it, I talk about it with them, and that just takes the pressure off. You know?
It does. I kind of grew up thinking the same way. Like I kind of had to have my stump speech, so to speak. Is that a reference you guys understand? In politics, like a politician does a stump speech? Okay. Sometimes I say things and you guys look at me like, what are you talking about?
I know what a stump speech is.
Okay.
Thanks, Katie.
But I think I had a different response than you, Mac. I think because it felt
or a sales pitch might be another way to put it.
Sure. Yep. That's a good one. But because it felt awkward to me, so I think there were a lot of times when I just didn't do it. It was like, yeah, that feels really weird, and so I'm just not going to do that.
And then did you feel guilty afterwards because you're like, oh, I didn't do what I was supposed to. A good Christian.
Yeah, I'm not
would
a good Christian. Yep. Yeah. And like I remember in college there was a group going on spring break to like Panama City Beach, Florida, which is one of the primary college partying destinations, and they were going to be like handing out tracts on the beach and walking up to like drunk college kids, and
Fun.
I felt like a bad kid, like a bad Christian for not wanting to go on that trip. But then once I started to learn this, it was a major light bulb moment for me. It was like, it felt like, oh, I can do that.
Yeah. I find that the best place to do evangelism is on a beach wearing a bathing suit using a tract. I'm just saying that's been the most effective in my experience.
Oh. Depends on the outfit, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, you just have to accept, and I have to accept this often as a parent, as a leader within an organization, as someone who cares about the people around me. Is I am not the primary agent of change in other people's lives. And I have to accept that, and I can experience more peace as I accept that further, because my role is, as you're saying, discerning what God is up to. And how often do we get ahead of what God might be doing or completely miss what God is doing in someone else's life because we're convinced we know what's best for them?
Yep. We assume too much responsibility, and we assume we know more than we actually do. So let's say you're okay. This person's open to me. They're open to me, and I've formed a relationship. I've gotten curious. There's safety there, and I notice God doing something in their life. I think I notice God at work in their life in some way. Then what? What do you do?
Yeah. Well, then you simply just invite them to say yes to what God is doing. And that can look different depending on the situation. I mentioned this couple earlier that I became friends with over the summer, and I remember there was a moment we were sitting down, and they were on either side of me having this sort of argument about church and about God and about what they should do, and it became very clear what God was doing in them, and it was very easy to name like, hey, my encouragement to you guys is like, I think you guys just need to like try a church and go, because it seems like it's what you want, but nothing has met your standards. So the challenge for them was just like, pick one and go.
Yeah.
See what happens.
Yeah.
Right. So the point is, it's not going to look like that. Like as much as we want it to be, attract you, hand out on a beach with a 3-step plan to get someone back to church. It's not going to be that. And you're going to have to do the work of discerning what God is doing and be willing to challenge, or maybe it's just invite more into relationship to continue the conversation. But tilting the table back to them to say yes to what God is doing is important.
Yeah, and maybe what I would say is to give an imagination of what that can sound like. Sometimes I use the word submit. Hey, can I submit something to you? Or hey, I think I might be noticing something. God seems to be doing this. What do you think about that? So it's not like, hey, a declaration. I guess what I'm getting at is I'm not declaring, here's what God's doing in your life. You know, it's more of a, hey, I think God might be up to something here.
Yeah.
This is what I'm noticing. What do you think about that?
Yeah.
So even the way you're inviting them to notice is different, right? So put it all together, okay? Like put these components together because it really will equip you in your relationships, both with people who don't know or follow Jesus or those who have dechurched. Identify or discern. Are they open to me? Are they a person of peace? Go where the grace is, right? If you're channeling lots of energy or putting a lot of time into someone who is, you're pursuing someone who's walking away from you, that's going to be counterproductive, okay? Step 2, if this person is open to you, get curious, ask questions, learn their story, and so on. And then become a divine detective. While you're getting curious, you're not just listening to their story, you're also trying to pay attention to what God's doing in their life. And if you notice something, you submit it to them and invite them to submit to it as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
This is the roadmap that I use when I'm engaging people, both who are I sense are far from Jesus or don't follow Jesus, as well as those who have walked away from the church. Are they open to me? Am I orienting with a posture of kindness and gentleness and curiosity? And what do I notice God doing in their life? And can I name that with them and invite them to respond to it?
Yeah, two things that stick out to me as we're talking, that two things that I would say maybe are required to do this well are both courage and humility, right? Like it takes some courage to approach people and get curious and ask questions and even to put those test balloons out there. I know for me sometimes that can really require courage. If it's someone who I feel like it'd just be easier to just talk about the weather or whatever, but I feel like God might be doing something here and he wants me to go there. But yet it also requires some humility. Knowing that we don't necessarily have the right thing to say to get them over the finish line.
Maybe what this is coming to me in the moment, so I'm just going to name it, but I think it could potentially equip some of our listeners. The other thing I might do when it comes to discerning what God's doing and inviting them to respond is oftentimes people are sitting on like really bad news about God, about themselves, about life or something. And so one of the ways I often will orient to that is just name it. Hey, man, it sounds like you're believing this about God or your life or yourself or your circumstances or whatever. And that's, I think I'd feel the same way if I believe that too. But I want to just declare that is, I know Jesus and that is not Jesus's heart towards you. So I'm sort of like taking their bad news and like summarizing it for them and then sort of pivoting and going, but I think this is declaring, this is the heart of God or the heart of Jesus towards you in a way that like oftentimes prompts more questions or seeking or openness.
Yeah. You'd be surprised at how those conversations can turn to when someone names like this leader messed up or this church member did this and just name like, I don't think God liked that. I don't think God liked it either.
Yeah.
That person did that to you.
Right.
Just helps shift. It draws attention to the fact that like I think there's an internal, there's something internal that was like blaming God for this, and like God's just as upset about it as you are.
Yeah.
All right. Well, you guys, it is praxis time. You know, we try to end every episode with getting really practical. Came across this quote recently by a guy named James Cone. Theological concepts have meaning only as they are translated into theological praxis. That is, the church living in the world on the basis of what it proclaims. So we want to end every episode going, okay, we've talked about a whole lot, but what can we do to actually embody our faith together? What would you guys say?
Yeah, I think it starts with prayer. No surprise. I think it's really important to just pray and discern what God is up to in the lives of people around you. Like asking the Holy Spirit to bring people to mind. God might have someone in mind that he wants you to connect with that you haven't even considered. One thing in our year-long leadership intensives, one exercise that we have everyone do is to go on a prayer walk around the neighborhood. And before they do that, we ask them to make a map of the houses that live in your neighborhood close to you and, put everyone by name in those little houses and then walk around and just pray for them by name as you walk. And I remember doing that exercise for the first time, and it was really impactful and meaningful for me. And it just helped me bring like a new level of intentionality and awareness to how God might be working in the lives of those around me. So, just ask God for eyes to help you notice who those people of peace are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've had some weird scenarios with this, not to scare our listeners, but I've gotten into the habit of at the end of maybe spending time with Jesus just creating some open space to listen and say, Jesus, is there anybody you want me to pray for or be intentional with? And sometimes really random people will come to mind. I remember a few years ago, someone came to mind that I went to grad school with that I hadn't talked to in like years. And I just felt this strong impression to reach out. And it felt awkward. So I texted, I'm like, hey, I know it's been probably like 10, 15 years since we've talked, but I was just praying and you came to mind. Hope you're doing well. Responds right away. This is a godsend. I have been consumed with alcohol. Nobody knows about it. Can we talk? So it's just to say, and I've had a number of those where it's just like, oh, all of a sudden this person is coming to mind in a really like feels like in a way outside of me. And then I'll reach out and it's like, oh, I literally am on my way to the hospital with this thing. Thank you so much. Will you pray with me? Like just stuff like that.
Yeah, so, that happened to me last night, actually.
It happened last night?
Yeah. Someone came to mind and I just texted them saying, hey, you're in my mind. Like, I'm just praying for you. And she said, hey, thanks so much. My mother-in-law died a year ago today and it's the first anniversary of her death. And
wow,
we're having a hard time with it.
Yeah. So it's just to say, when you say pray. Like, ask God to help you identify people that you're supposed to invest in.
Yeah. Yeah. Practice number 2 would just be then authentically engage with those people around you. Like, be willing to build genuine relationships without any end in mind. Just move towards people who are clearly open to you. Keep your antennas up for what the Holy Spirit is up to, like we were already saying, praying and discerning. And practice naming some of that grace and truth that we were talking about, like being willing to point out when there's like a belief about God that we would call bad news. Like practice being willing to do that, and sort of just like stay in the game, I guess.
I think the third practice, the one that I would share, is kind of heavy hitting, but it maybe encapsulates this entire series and why we're even having to deal with this. So I'll just name the practice. Lean into the rhythms of your church community. Like, actually follow the way of Jesus with and alongside other people, okay? One of the big things or themes I'm hearing from people of Dechurched is that the church isn't doing what it says it's all about.
Yeah.
It's about following Jesus, but the church I experience doesn't look or sound or feel anything like Jesus. Now, in fairness, no church will ever arrive. Okay, we're all works, and so there is a sense in like, well, that's all of us, And I'm not using that but we also ought to not use that as an excuse. But I think there's more transformation that we can experience in the church. I think God wants more for us. And so the best thing you can do for the people around you is to actually live a compelling life as a follower of Jesus. If you want people to follow Jesus, then show them what it looks like in community connected to a church. Put your money where your mouth is. Invest in a community. Live out the 5 tenets of community we talked about in our last episode, right? Live out the way of Jesus in a way that's compelling. That is the best apologetic, so to speak, that we can give people who have Dechurched is like, they're missing out on something that they see being lived out in a unique way.
Yeah. You're ideally you're inviting someone into the rhythms you already do. So you're not telling someone you better go to church.
Right.
It's come along with me. Like, I love being here. This is what I do. How much easier that is to invite someone to church when you're invested in it than guilting a family member to go back to church when they haven't been there in a while.
Yeah.
Much different.
I was in a conversation. This is what gives you credibility. I was in a conversation recently where they were narrating some hurt and pain they experienced in the church that caused them to walk away. And I said, hey, I've experienced some hurt and pain in the church too.
Yeah.
And they looked at me and they know my story and they're like, wow, you've actually experienced like a mountain more than I have. And that's changed. Like it changed the dynamic in the conversation because they're talking to someone who is like living it out, right? So that's what I'm getting at, is like they need to see the authenticity of your faith and followership of Jesus.
Well, this has been a really good conversation. Maybe to summarize what we've said, I think when it comes to the people in our lives who have dechurched, we want to engage them in a Jesus-looking way. We don't want to write them off, but we also don't want to come at them in like overbearing or unhelpful ways. We want to engage them with openness and curiosity, paying attention to where God is already at work in their lives. And we want to always be ready to extend an invitation for them to step into God's activity, whether that be in church or in another area of life.
Yeah. So thanks for joining us today. I want to tell you where we're headed next. This kind of closes out this series. So we're about to head into Christmas and New Year's. And then after the new year, we're going to pick back up and we're going to do a series on forgiveness. And maybe just to set up briefly, the tension I'll just say is this: pretty much everyone that I know agrees that forgiveness is at the heart of the gospel. And yet, everybody struggles with it, forgiving other people. And so we want to take a step into that tension and outline some mechanics for forgiveness and what gets in the way of it. So that's where we're headed, and we hope you'll tune in.
Praxis is recorded and produced at Crosspoint Community Church. You can find out more about the show and our church at crosspointwi.com. If you have any questions, comments, or have any suggestions for future topics, feel free to send us an email. Also, if you enjoy the show, consider leaving a review. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.